Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on our latest Fiscal Note Advocacy webinar, Using Technology to Aid Your Advocacy Outcomes. This is a particularly popular one. We're always hearing, of course, about the future and how technology will and is changing our lives, but what if you could harness that data that you already have or use polling to determine the sort of advocacy or legislative efforts that you should be pursuing? Well, our experts today are going to talk about just how you can do that. I'm Anne Dermody. I'm the Content Marketing Director here at Fiscal Note and CQ. And we're joined today by Adam Probolski, who is the president of Probolski Research, a full-service opinion research firm specializing in market research and opinion research on elections and public policy, working on behalf of business, government, nonprofit, special interest, and media clients. Adam's been a pollster and strategic advisor on hundreds of successful crisis communications and public affairs projects for local, county, and statewide initiatives and candidate campaigns, as well as citizen outreach and education efforts. And he's been a key advisor to the firm's clients on matters of public policy, legislation, and business strategy. We're also joined by Joshua Haberski. Josh is the Assistant Vice President of Advocacy at the Independent Community Bankers of America. He's the Chairman of the Grassroots Professional Network, a contributing editor to Campaigns and Elections, and an adjunct professor at George Washington University's Graduate School of Political Management. And last but certainly not least, we have Vlad Eidelman, and Vlad is our own Vice President of Research here at Fiscal Note, and he's over a decade of experience developing state-of-the-art machine learning systems for a broad range of neurolinguistic processing applications in academia and industry. And if none of that makes any sense to you, Vlad is going to clear up exactly what all that means when we get to him. So I think I'm going to hand things over to Josh first.
Thanks, Anne. Definitely an interesting topic for predicting advocacy using technology to aid your advocacy outcomes. I'm going to talk a lot about associations because that's the perspective that I bring to the table. I know we have some other experts on this webinar that will talk a little bit more and more technical. They have experience in polling and artificial intelligence, but I'll scratch the surface a little bit. First and foremost, I think that, when looking at polling and research specifically can be a great member benefit. It's something that can drive folks and interest into the association themselves. Also, you can show force in releasing polling and information. If there's a lot of people that support an initiative that you're pushing forth, the polling will be a way to fortify showing that broad support of the general public and push lawmakers to take interest in that. It also will gauge opinion and your member feedback. In the association, this is critical that you're routinely asking your members for their input and insights as you develop your policy agenda and your overall outline for your government relations strategy. Another really important point of research in utilizing technology for that is audience segmentation and outreach and strategy. And this can be coupled with a lot of different insights from consultants, but you also have a lot at your fingertips in some of the feedback that you get just in your dashboard from using technology like Fiscal Note, Voter Voice, or CQ. There's a lot of basics in that technology suite that you can take and gauge your members' opinion and get their feedback directly from there, which can influence your overall strategy. This type of overall research is a component of public relations and public affairs strategies. I think you can utilize it and leverage it to get not only the general public interested in on an issue, but also tap into the media and showcase of the Independent Community Bankers of America, 70% of our membership supported X or supported Y, and utilize that to get some press coverage for it, or utilize that to get into different industry publications or blogs to showcase that you are on the forefront of an issue. So another thing, and some folks that know me from previous webinars, I used to work at the American Motorcyclist Association, and one of the most interesting campaigns that we've put together involved some survey research where we released a presidential poll with the help of a coalition, and in that we were able to come in front of an issue and be a leader on polling on E15, which is ethanol and fuel, and we were the purveyors of this poll, and that was a good way to show interest in the association, gain traction as a leader on that issue, visibility, and it was a poll conducted through a third-party researcher. We were able to take that, showcase that to our membership first, dig down and provide communications, targeted communications to segments of our membership, and leverage that for advocacy. Once we released a poll showing the results were favorable towards our position. We utilized those statistics and those metrics and created calls to actions and specific alerts based off of that polling. So that was a win-win where our consulting team did a great job and our in-house staff was able to create those follow-up communications and advocacy communications that were centered around what we were doing on the poll and survey research. So one of the things, and you hear this from time to time, I think polling is a component of overall research strategy, and I'm sure Adam can definitely talk and speak more to this, but you have to have an overall research strategy where polling is a component. You have other components of that research strategy. It might be focus groups. It might be, general sit down with a group of people that are stakeholders or your industry, or do a quick call to get feedback. Sometimes triage what potential problems could arise if you decide to release a piece of information or polling. Information is powerful when it comes to advocacy. Polling, is an important piece of that, but it's grounded in other components. Just as you have your overall GR strategy, research is a component of that, and polling is a component of research. Another thing, polling can check the temperature of your organization. It can dial back. In certain meetings, you may feel as though an issue it needs to be on the forefront of your association, but you don't necessarily have the metrics to back you up. So conducting some informal polls, some surveys, surveys. We use surveys through Voter Voice occasionally to take the information and see where our membership is looking in the future for actions that we take or grassroots campaigns that we want to run. It's informative to both functional and executive levels of the organization. So folks that are, creating and crafting the messaging, like myself, in the grassroots and the advocacy roles, but also the C-suite is interested in this information. When you're out creating speeches for convention or lobby days, or even going on tour across the country and speaking with your stakeholders and your association members, knowing the pulse of your organization is important. It's also interesting to look at polling and counter-polling. You may release a piece of information, and competitors in the industry will go ahead and create a counter-poll to refute some of that information. So it's one of those things. Really look at the data set itself. Look at the information behind the poll. And the organization putting that information out there. Not every organization puts out credible information, so it's important to put a check against some of that. Most organizations have a polling schedule whether they know it or not, and I think that some people by second nature will routinely ask membership for their preferences or their opinions on things, and that is informal polling. As I mentioned before, sometimes you'll contact a survey researcher like Adam to conduct a comprehensive assessment or a comprehensive poll. and in-house options and outside options, I think, work best when they're utilizing that information together. So, working with the information that's housed in your software suite, like Fiscal Note and Voter Voice, and then taking that information and creating follow-up questions and follow-up polling, working with someone like Adam is always a great option. In your overall research strategy, it's very helpful to keep your messaging focused. So, what is working to recruit advocates, to mobilize advocates? That's where your overall research strategy and polling comes together. It can be helpful in looking at how granular your phrasing in an action alert can be. So, should I mention this phrase or that phrase? And that overall research, not just the basic polling, will tell you that story. That will craft your message and craft what your talking points may be. It may even go as far as what images or pictures that will render emotion when creating this messaging and this action alert. It also will look into scoring and grouping. You can group your advocates into subsets of who is interested in X issue or Y issue and score them. What is the likelihood that they're going to take action? What is the likelihood that they're going to support a different initiative? And it really will shed a lot of light on the effectiveness of your messaging. So, you may be conducting, your alerts and your messaging one way, and you'll have to pivot at some point once you get your research back, so that this is the best route to take for us, so that we're not, leading people astray. The targeting of your messaging in an overall research strategy, that's important. Looking at what legislators, you can't spend all of your resources targeting every member of Congress every time, or every state legislature every time, or every council member. You might want to focus in on the swing votes. Well, who are the swing votes? Looking at their voter data, you can identify, all right, this is a swing district of who might be persuadable on this issue, and target your communications towards that person in particular. And same holds true with your advocate set, looking at them. Who are the best people that we should be targeting to message to get them to take action? You don't want to do the shotgun blast going out to all of your membership every single time, and this research strategy will help hone in on that. Now moving on, and I'll just briefly talk to artificial intelligence and machine learning. This is not my area of expertise, but I think that there's a lot of opportunities and strengths here to improve customer, constituent, and member service. I think the barrier of entry for the intake process is often reduced in the advocacy sense when using these tools, and it allows you to get hyper-personalized without a lot of time and effort, ultimately leading to an increase in the number of output or the number of actions that you're able to do and generate, using little cost and little time. A lot of people have talked about this is the future of advocacy and the future of the advocacy frontier in terms of technology.
Thanks, Josh. So let's go over to Adam now for some information on using opinion research to improve your advocacy outcomes.
Thank you, Anne. We're going to talk about using research to improve advocacy outcomes. And our goal is to kind of give you a picture of the different ways that research is used in the advocacy process and some of the tools that we use along the way. We want you to kind of think about research in terms of, for advocacy, in terms of policy and legislation, of course, making clear how the public thinks or voters think about a certain policy to get support for it. But beyond that, there's other ways that we use research, like contract procurement. You're trying to get a contract with a government agency and making it clear that there's public support for the way you do it, or your corporation versus another, your organization. Certainly in crises and in PR in general. So other ways, other reasons to use research in that whole process, but those are some of those key ways that we see it used on a regular basis. So we like to say that this is there's no brain surgery here when it comes to research, but there's definitely great value in basically proving that the engaged minority, which is oftentimes very vocal, doesn't represent the majority. And of course, polling, as much as pollsters like us like to think that our research is the key to success, we recognize fully that poll results are never the only determining factor for decision makers, but it's definitely a great tool in that process, one that you can use essentially in any situation you are from an advocacy standpoint. Let's get right into it, the audiences. There's a lot of different audiences that we do research for. Most importantly, and I don't really focus too much on this, but most importantly internally, the idea that you're going to have the messages that resonate the best and know who should be your message carrier and have that confidence that you have the public or the particular voters or whatever constituency it is on your side, and then you can demonstrate that broadly, publicly, is very kind of reassuring, but it's very strategic as well. So looking first at, let's say, elected officials and staff. No secret here that that's who we're trying to oftentimes paint a clear picture of public opinion for. And elected officials, I caution to suggest that don't just think of it as senators and members of the Congress. This is definitely a tool that we use in legislatures, and as many of us realize, there's a whole lot of local legislation and regional actions that are taken by government, and so they are just as keen and interested in data as a member of Congress. You may see a mayor or a county commissioner as less sophisticated, but they're probably not, and they have just as much of an interest in the data. Well, they're the ones that are oftentimes going to see the information, appreciate the fact that their bosses are going to be in good standing when they take the particular action they're going to take, based upon the fact that the polling shows that they're going to be supported. We like to call it courage in a bottle. Essentially, if the decision maker, the policy maker, is feels like they're in a bind and doesn't know if they should be supporting a particular policy, and you can show them the data that says the public is on their side, it's that kind of little shot in the arm that says, okay, I'm a little bit concerned about it, but you just showed me that there's public support, and I can jump on board with that. And that's again, not the only reason why they might come on board. They may be predisposed, hopefully, to supporting your cause, but it gives them that little extra courage to be able to take the next step. Looking at another audience, the media and blogosphere, they definitely love to hate on polls, but they also eat them up. And media is sometimes reticent to publish a poll from any particular source that isn't something that their organization has already contracted with. But you'll see, if you look today, there's 100 stories about polls that weren't from that particular media outlet. And the blogosphere, of course, absolutely looks for every opportunity to write a story about a poll, and they're going to use it for sure. So it's certainly a great avenue, again, with elected officials, but here you have the media who will embrace the data, maybe pick it apart a little bit, but at least they're going to be talking about it and showing the public that there is support. You want to get that message out in the broadest possible basis and to feed into the next several audiences, and this is a great place to do it with. Social media and sharing, an obvious reality today that you're going to potentially, if you decide to release your results to the media, you're going to certainly share it on social media. The part here that I think is so essential is the sharing part. Putting it on your organization's social media platforms is great, but the idea that your supporters, your champions, are going to be sharing the poll results and promoting it, doing all their tagging and things like that, is really the key component here. Giving them the something essentially to do, right? I think Josh will tell you that one of the key things you want to always do in an advocacy effort, even if you don't necessarily need something big from supporters, give them something to take action on so they feel like they're having a meaningful part of it, and that's the key here. If you give them a great infographic, a great video, something that just shows the results to research that advances your cause, they're going to want to promote that and show that and share it with their friends and other people on their social media. So it's an awesome tool to advance the message and move it forward. We love to call supporters, people on their side, champions, and champions can mean your members, the people that are already a part of your organization that you're using on a regular basis for grassroots advocacy, or quite frankly, people that you collect along the way, whatever your message or cause is. One of the things you can do in a poll, and this is in traditional polling or other kinds of research, there's very few, well, I shouldn't say few, but there are some ethical components to research. I don't think a lot of people equate pollsters with ethical, but we are, and we have some industry standards, and one of them is that we never release results from individual respondents, right? That's the biggest no-no in the research business. But we can, at some point in the research process, when we're asking questions, ask people if they are willing to talk to the sponsors of the poll, if they're willing to have communication with the organization, and in that process we can collect sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, sometimes thousands of people who say, yes, I'm interested. At that point, you can start to identify from that group of people who are interested enough in the subject matter to actually talk to you and identify, champions. If it's a 50-50 issue, well, half of those people are going to be on your side, and they're going to want to be those people that are sharing things on social media, potentially be third-party validators, the kinds of people you're going to want to use. And obviously, your own database is a key here. They all want to have something, again, to do. And they want to know that they're not alone, that there's big support out there from other people, from there's this big mass of humanity that's on their side too, and polling can absolutely give, and other research can absolutely give them that confidence that what they're doing is kind of meaningful and is a part of the group trying to accommodate. And it's a big, powerful way to shore up your champions and give them. So let's demonstrate support. That's really what we're fundamentally trying to accomplish here. We're trying to get from potentially no to yes, or like I said, give that courage in a bottle. How do we do that? Well, here we go. Here's just an example. I think it's important not to read too much into my examples, but this is an example of, let's say, a poll that can be done in a state where you're trying to inform and effectuate a legislator or a let's say a U.S. senator. So here we talk about cannabis businesses not being able to open bank accounts. Should the law be changed to fix this? We find 72% support in this particular poll. So this shows that broad-based, big number yes. and gives them that idea, that picture that there's very little arguing with 72%, and you never discount the 22 that say no, and the fact that there are some folks that are unsure. But having such a big number at 72% when elections are won by hundreds of votes and the country is oftentimes very divided shows this big, broad coalition of supporters, and that's really what you're trying to at times accomplish. If you can find that big, broad number, you're going to want to probably promote that to the greatest extent possible. So this is showing that, demonstrating that broad-based support. Next, we look to figure out what our best messages are. We tend to when every pollster, every researcher, would love to spend hours, days getting the full download from their client. Sometimes it's more like 20 minutes and go. But essentially, you want to take your all your messages that are the best messages you have that you think are your best messages, and quite frankly, test the best messages of your opposition. And that can be hard to stomach for some organizations, the idea that you're paying to test the messages of your opponent, but you really want to understand the impact of what something you say in the press or in front of a big crowd is going to do versus what the messages of your opponent are going to do. So it's a critical component to doing to understanding what people think. So in this case, this is kind of a local project. They're building some big hotel or housing, and the best message in this particular project was the fact that they're engaging the help of locally based union members to build the project. Again, 70% of the people become more likely to support the project based upon the fact that they're involving local labor, the XYZ Proud Local 101 in this particular example. So they're in a typical course of research would have perhaps 3, 5, 10, 25 of these messages to be tested, and you'll identify the ones in ranked order that are your best, and those are the ones you wear on your sleeve. Those are the ones you promote on social media. Those are the ones you use in your briefing documents for the legislators and or whoever it is you're briefing. And even if you're not releasing these results publicly, those are the ones that you talk about in your talking points and make sure that you're in front of the right message with the right audiences, which we'll get to in a minute. So here's another example. Of one that isn't so definitive. So American manufacturing jobs are worth fighting for. And they're worth fighting for, quite frankly, in this case, even if we get into a trade war with allies like Canada and United Kingdom in this particular example. 40% agree and only 14% disagree, which seems like a great differential, a great factor of positive for the person trying to proffer this message. The fact is, though, there's this big number of unsure on a question like this because there's a lot of uncertainty here with this kind of charged language and potential impact of what that can mean. So what happens with this? Well, if this number shows up, you're probably going to sit down with a supportive legislator or elected official and staff and say, look, we've got great support out there, but guess what? We're going to do the hard work we need to do to bring those unsure voters on board to give you the backup you need. So there's some examples here of, the numbers aren't off the charts, but we're going to do the work we need, and we're going to talk to those unsure voters or constituents to the extent that we need to. And then we go into targeting our message. And this is really helpful and a critical part of any kind of a outreach campaign to the extent that you want to bring the public on board and demonstrate that you have them. You don't. Obviously, America is not is not exactly cohesive at the moment, and there's a lot of divisive issues, and a lot of people are very divided. So here in this particular case, we talk about targeting. Looks like Democrats are more supportive. They agree at 55% because we round up that number. Republicans, only a third agree. You've got a majority that disagree. And then you kind of see some differences amongst rural voters versus urban voters and education levels. In this case, it's this idea that, this example anyway, that we're going to protect natural open space by having high-density housing in urban areas rather than kind of having this urban sprawl concept. And you can see how these different kinds of voters break down. So the key here is if you needed to move more support from Republicans, you would know that from this poll, and you would know what messages from earlier on in the research would effectuate Republicans and what would move them. So that's a clear example. The one thing that I would really caution, there may be some stereotypes that show up in this particular example, but it's really important not to assume Republicans or Democrats are going to vote one particular way, or that college-educated versus high school voters are going to have some particular perception of a problem. There's big nuances to how people feel based on geography and other demographics and socioeconomics. So it's really important not to make assumptions, and that's obviously a kind of a pitch for statistically valid research. But it's a truth. You can't just assume the facts, and it's important to understand what they are. So those big broad numbers are great, but these numbers give you that kind of deep dive, and whether if you're picking up a phone and you're talking to a particular demographic, you have a pretty good sense of who's going to who be on your side. And again, who you have to target if you want to move the ball. So choose your best messenger. We find that some organizations basically have one messenger, and that's okay. But sometimes there's a better messenger. And in this case, you'll see here in a minute, we ask, who do you trust more? And this can be maybe a little bit jarring for some folks, but let's take a look. First, we have the spokesman, right? He's got the perfectly suited up and pearly whites, maybe not so pearly, but he's looking good. He's polished, and so you'd think that he might be the right guy to speak out for you. You've got the engineer, right? He's there in the lab. He's doing some tooling and dyeing and calculations, and he might be a person, but we're always hesitant to put the engineer up front because they're just not people persons. Is the kind of typical line. And then we've got the operator, the guy who's actually on the line, building it, operating it, turning the valves, whatever it is that is relevant to your industry. But he's a guy that also is not typically seen as the spokesperson, not typically seen as the person in front of the press conference or walking the halls when you're presenting your message. But let's take a look and see how these stack up. Who do you trust more? Well, it looks like the engineer here gets 83% trust value over the spokesperson at 17. So what I don't want to do here is suggest that you never put your suit in front of the camera again or in front of a member of Congress again. That's silly and not realistic. What I am saying here is in the moment of crisis or in the moment where you have something that does kind of rise to the level of media attention and broader public interest, you're going to probably want to have that person who has some technical skill, and give them those skills, give them give them the way to smile and relate to the crowd, so they can be an effective spokesperson for you. Even better, it turns out that the operator gets 89% trust factor over the spokesperson at 10%. So this is another great example of getting that line worker, getting your person who's functionally doing the work of your organization, of your member organizations, and put them in front. People trust the guy who's doing the hard work. And in this case, we just have men, and there's no commentary on the world at all. It just happens to be examples. If I put women in these roles, it would be essentially the same. So don't ever discount the idea of rolling out, and not gratuitously, of course, because that gets really transparent and people don't like that. But the operator and the engineer, or whoever that person is in your organization, give them the skills, give them the tools, give them the training so that they are comfortable being in front of the camera, sharing their story on social media, and being a part of that process. We come to kind of a very technology-driven component of research. Up till now, we've been talking about a telephone survey, an online survey, a survey that's conducted through social media. How do we get from there to something that's a little more hip, interesting, and maybe a little more qualitative, get some real understanding of how people are thinking and talking about things? Well, we call it a field focus group that we invented this product. It's not like we're evil geniuses. There's other ways of accomplishing this. The typical focus groups can do the job. This just happens to be a little bit faster. So we'll take a look here at what we call a field focus group, and you'll get the gist of it really quick. We'll have you listen in. So you'll see some people talking on the screen, and you'll understand it really quick here. Let's see here.
Amazon is just a greedy company. They're all about making money.
I blame Amazon. They make plenty of money. I don't think that all these companies coming to New York should think that they should get free taxes.
Yeah, I think Amazon was like a big baby. Just because we had some objections to them getting tax incentives and things, they picked up their jacks and went home.
Yeah, the elected officials don't understand the capitalists. They don't understand the business and don't realize that the tax return from 25,000 workers could be much greater than the tax credit.
I blame the elected officials because they didn't even give a chance to the deal.
Elected officials are to blame because they don't want to make states business friendly.
The crooked socialist Democrats in New York ruined the chance to get Amazon's headquarters.
I think the politicians should have kept their mouths shut because there are so many benefits to having Amazon in New York State.
So some pretty hyper language there from New Yorkers who were reacting the day of, we did this field focus group, the day of Amazon letting the world know that they were pulling out of HQ2 from New York City. And so the goal here with a tool like this is to get certainly immediate feedback, something that pretty much any pollster can pull off, some kind of a quick survey. But in this case, get the visceral reaction, but get the language that people use. There's a difference between identifying is there support or opposition, or who do you blame, right, in this case for Amazon pulling out. But here you have the actual language they use, the words that they use, so you can then start to use some of that language in your media outreach. In this case, would maybe potentially be considered a crisis or PR, and or show the public that kind of matching their language is really, really useful, and that's what you get out of this. And plus, you potentially get for your organizational internally this kind of visual. We tend to see different kinds of people look at data differently. So whereas as pollsters we love crosstabs and numbers on a page, sometimes people are much happier seeing the charts and graphs we've just already shown. And in this case, sometimes people are much more visual and like to listen to things, and you really end up with a clearer picture of how people see and talk about a subject matter. So finally, we have some key takeaways. Again, no brain surgery here. Let's demonstrate support with research, identify your best messages and your messengers, figure out how to target your message, whether that's talking to people that like you or talking to people that might not, how to bring them on board, and then, of course, use the technology-driven research that you can use to help tell your full story and give you that full picture. And back to you.
Great. Thank you, Adam. And one kind of quick question, some really great, interesting insights there, sort of seeing behind the veil a little bit for us of polling. But one thing that does strike me, and this I suppose comes from my journalism background a little bit, but the context of the messaging and in terms of the questions is important, right? And important, I suppose, when one questions the validity of any given poll. So there were two slides that you had that struck me in particular. One, an earlier one on where you asked, I think, is it better to retain manufacturing jobs in the U.S. or are folks in support of retaining manufacturing jobs in the U.S.? And then that second one about who's to blame for the Amazon pullout in New York. And I suppose how the question is framed is important in terms of who will answer and how they will answer. If, for example, you had that manufacturing one, if the question had been, say, is it better to retrain the workforce for tech jobs to try and or to try and save declining manufacturing jobs in the U.S., would the weighted answer be somewhat different? Likewise, with the Amazon question, choosing the word blame implies that there is a blame, right? That there is somebody to hold responsible for this. So I just was kind of curious as to your take on that and to whether, it could be perceived that there's a little bit of spin doctoring going on based on how folks would ask you to poll.
Sure. So certainly I don't want to give the expectation that you shouldn't ask the very basic yes, no, support, oppose question in the most unbiased way possible to give yourself. You don't want to fool yourself to thinking you have something you don't. So we absolutely always ask that question, generally at the beginning of a survey and at the end, without any of those biasing factors, or at least as few of the biasing factors as you possibly can. So obviously here we had some really specific examples, but for sure, you ask the question, very basic, want to make sure you understand where people stand without any kind of messaging. But in this case, we offered some examples with what I think you can probably say is charged language or messages that we're trying to test. And that's essentially how the real world works, is people say what they think and proffer ideas and words, and we want to know in the real world how that will turn out in a broader scheme, in a broader world, how one person's words will play out. So that's why in this case we chose some pretty charged examples. The last part of that is we always ask questions in different ways. Most pollsters do this. So they'll ask that very basic, yes, no, support, oppose question at the beginning and the end of their research tool. But in addition to that, we like to do the, let's say, Duran versus Sanchez idea of the neighbor-to-neighbor discussion, right? The neighbor's talking over the back fence. Duran says, that's crazy. It's the worst idea ever. And Sanchez says, it's the best thing ever. We're going to prosper because of it. And see how which camp people jump into. And what's interesting is we find very different information oftentimes when we're kind of putting it in that neighbor-to-neighbor format. And that really is the essentially the kind of thing that I often say we never want results to leak, but if results leak, that would be the question we want to leak, because oftentimes it shows the most stark difference between people's responses, because they're kind of relating to the individuals, they're relating to the neighbor-to-neighbor conversation, and it shows kind of exacerbated support generally for a cause, because it's people relating to people.
Right, yeah, makes sense. And maybe it's more of an indication of kind of the times we live in, that every question can almost be interpreted as provocative, So,
yes.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Well, thanks again, Adam. That was great. So now let's go over to Vlad.
Thanks, Anne. So what I wanted to talk about today is how can we use technology to help with understanding how to create advocacy campaigns, what issues are involved, and how we can help identify who to target, how to target them, and create messages. And so I think the great thing is that there's technology that we can use across all of these parts of the process, from the first part, which is identifying the issue that is something that you care about and that you think your advocates or members might care about, and then understanding something about that issue. The second part is then obviously identifying the policymakers or the other stakeholders involved, and then which advocates or which members or parts of your list are going to care about that and want to take action. And then the last part is creating something compelling that calls them to action, that calls them to do something for your organization, for the cause, for that issue. And so fortunately, whether we realize it or not, there's actually a lot of data that we've already collected in most advocacy campaigns in most organizations about the issues we care about, the kind of advocates that we have that have been either responsive or not responsive, and then the kinds of actions that have been taken. And data is great, but it doesn't really help us by itself. What we need to do is analyze it, create stories around it, create a narrative to try to figure out how can we improve our decision-making, improve our process in using it. And so the nice part about what artificial intelligence can offer is in helping us sift through lots of data and understand patterns that are in it to inform decision-making. So oftentimes I think we hear the word artificial intelligence thrown around, and we have various kinds of images in our mind, from the benevolent to the ominous, but really what artificial intelligence is, what AI is the science and sometimes the art of trying to use machines to solve problems that usually we would associate with human intelligence. It is not focused on creating human general intelligence that can solve all of our problems or even act like us or think like us or be emotionally cognizant like us. It's really technically almost an engineering problem of creating tools that will really complement the things that we're doing already and help us do them either better or faster, or sometimes remove parts of the process that are really routine and manual and that we might not even want to do in the first place, but we have to do because there's no really alternative. And so what AI enables is us to do things that may have not been possible before, just with our own efforts, or that would have been really prohibitively expensive. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that actually means and how that plays into the advocacy process a little later on. And there are two really important subfields within AI that I think we should focus on, which is NLP, natural language processing, which is taking text, taking natural language text in English and French and German, and using computational tools to do something with it, to understand it, to generate automatically text, or in other ways to process it, like sentiment analysis or identifying stands. That's really critical for advocacy campaigns because there's obviously messages going out in text form, whether it's emails or texts or other kinds of communication that we want to make sure that we're using to the best advantage to encourage our advocates or our members to do something, take action. And then the other subfield that's really important is machine learning, and that's how do we write algorithms, create machines that take examples of some behavior and then learn how to do that behavior without us having to explicitly program that in. And that's complementary to natural language processing. So NLP is concerned with doing something useful with text. It's pretty ambivalent as to how we do it. We could write rules, or we could try to learn it automatically. Machine learning is the tool. It's the how. It's how we're going to build a system. And you can apply machine learning to other kinds of data, to an image file or a text file or Excel spreadsheet. So it's sort of two complementary things. NLP is the what. It's the problem space we're trying to solve for using text. And machine learning is the how. We're going to take a bunch of examples of something, a bunch of documents, a bunch of messages that we've sent before that have been good, and try to learn something useful about them. And so AI is actually all around you. It's in your daily life in ways that you probably sometimes recognize and sometimes don't. So as a consumer, most companies have now incorporated some form of AI into their products that you use. So Netflix's recommendation engine that recommends movies for you in different genres, or Siri or Cortana or Alexa, all of these automated assistants are all using AI in some form to help address your queries. And you see the same thing on Kayak when you're buying a flight, or on Renfin when you're looking at a house value. All of these products are incorporating data, different kinds of data, right? It's what movies you've viewed, what questions you've asked, what purchases people have made on airlines, what houses people buy, and whatever the data set is, there's really useful information inside of it that can help you in your consumer life. And the complement to that is that AI is increasingly useful for our work life in being able to understand and inform our decision-making in really practical ways.
So Vlad, given that AI is all around us now all the time, how can advocacy organizations, and in particular, say, Fiscal Note clients who might be listening, take advantage of that right now?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because what we're really looking for is practical applications today that help and inform your current workflow and help you make your job a bit easier in some ways and enable you to do other things with your time. So if we just go starting from that first part of the process in identifying an issue or identifying specific bills or regulations that are coming up that are going to be something that you want to advocate or fundraise around or really target, there's thousands of new state regulatory legislative initiatives happening every day, when the sessions are in action and current, and it's very hard to keep up with the flow of information. Now we can add in, federal on top of that and other local officiating bodies, and so there's just a ton of information that we now have to ingest and deal with, and it's very hard, almost impossible, to keep up with that without some sort of technology to assist us in prioritizing or identifying things that might be really important. So first application, and it's a pretty common one, which we have at Fiscal Note, is that you can identify the topics, sort of the semantics inside of a document. What are the concepts that are important to this document? What is it dealing with? What is the subject matter that is in this issue? And then in this case, what we're looking at is an example of a new piece of legislation proposing some definitions and changing what short-term rentals mean. And so there might be an organization who cares about that kind of change and what that means for their business. And so they're going to need to be aware of any of these initiatives in any state and be able to respond to them. And so obviously, if you find one, then there might be ways in which we can facilitate finding others. So if we identify what's in green automatically as text within the document that is really important, short-term rentals, residential property, zoning variants, then we can build up a whole graph of relations between those words, and we can identify other documents that you may not be aware of that we can then show and say, here are other kinds of initiatives maybe in other states by other people that are also targeting similar conceptual issues, and that might be a way that you can expand either the issues that you cover or just even understand what the current state of some level of issue is and what the trend is, if there's a growing trend for some kind of legislation or regulation, and then you can use that in your messaging and your targeting to identify people who might care. So that's the first part, just identifying the issue, the relevant issues. And so the second part is, once you have something in mind, there's obviously a stakeholder or policymaker behind that. And so what we also do at Fiscal Note is we try to analyze the people involved in the policymaking process. And we know a lot about the legislators and the regulators involved, so we can create these kind of analyses where for a given organization, we can identify the policymakers that are more or less aligned with you. And looking at you here is a visualization of policymakers in Congress, and from left to right, you go from more liberal to more conservative, and from down to up, you go from less aligned with a position that you've taken on a certain issue to more aligned. And so this can help you really easily identify people who you probably already know are on your side of an issue, and maybe you don't need to advocate for something as much, or maybe you continue to because that's how they've been aligned in the past. And maybe you can also identify people who you previously didn't recognize were also maybe voting or sponsoring or acting in ways that are aligned with you, but you didn't even know that they're there, and you can help support them and keep that behavior going. And then obviously third, you can identify people who might not always be aligned, but maybe in some issues they are and some they aren't. And so this is more of a way to figure out who to target, what kind of advocacy campaigns, and who might be a better use of your time to target and send messages to, in ways in which you can do that. And so once you've identified an issue and the stakeholders involved, then the third part is trying to identify who are your members or your advocates that are going to care. How are you going to leverage them in order to be successful in running a campaign? And that's really important. So what we've started to do here at Fiscal Note as well is use our vast database of billions of messages that are sent a year to help understand what does it mean for an advocacy campaign to be effective. What are the rates at which people open messages and then take action? And so knowing this information is really powerful. You can start doing quite a few things. You can start by simply segmenting your members or your advocates into groups, and there's a number of features you can use for that. But that's where something like machine learning comes in, because you wouldn't know what patterns to look for. You wouldn't know necessarily that someone's location plus the time of day plus the way that the message was framed around a certain issue is really what drove someone over the edge to take action. And so by using machine learning, you can help identify these patterns without knowing that they exist. You can just have all of the data that you have about your advocates, and maybe you complement it with additional data that you can get from somewhere else. And then you have what they've done for you in the past, if they've done it or if they've taken action on some message, and you can start segmenting them into different groups. And you know some groups really care about certain issues or at certain times, other groups don't. And so you don't waste energy and time sending the same messages out to all the same people. You can start to segment and be smart about when you want to advocate or when you want to target some group of them. And once you have that, you can actually do something even cooler, which is once you've identified some patterns of your advocates or members that are indicative of them being advocates for you, then you can go out and start to have other sources of data that already have computed some of the same demographic information or maybe donation information, and then acquire more advocates, but not just a random list of people who may or may not care, but then actually pick out the ones that are actually most likely to be similar to the ones that you've already had. And that's another aspect of machine learning, where you cluster together things that look similar, and then since you've known in the past that the people you're identifying similarity to are actually really effective, the new people you acquire should also be. So this is one way that, without too much manual crawling through new databases and new Rolodex and new lists, you can at least prioritize the people that you think might be good additional advocates or members for you to reach out to. And then sort of once you've done all that, identified the issue, identified the stakeholders, segmented, and started to understand something about your current advocates, the last part that there's interesting work going on now for is trying to automatically change and personalize the content that is created, both that goes out to an advocate from you as a call to action or informational campaign, and then the actual action that they take, whether it might be a web form or a template or some other letter that they write. And so on the first part of that is you can start, as in kind of traditional marketing, testing different kinds of messaging. And so if you have a campaign that you're trying to run or a call to action that you have, you first want to test some variations of ways in which we can express it. And since we know something about the people already, we know some of the demographic information, we can start correlating what works for certain people, and then in the future for the next subsequent campaigns, we can use that to increase the rate of action, and we are easily able to monitor that. So one of the really important parts with using any AI or machine learning is to be able to evaluate, assess, and then iterate on how we're using it. And so we can capture these metrics of how people are opening, how they're actually acting, if they're acting, and then we can measure that over time to show that we've been increasing the action rate, that we've been increasing the amount of money that we've been able to fundraise. And that's a really powerful message to say that we can use this technology to monitor actual organizational KPIs or strategic goals and move them. And then the last phase, which is once you know something about the people, you can also pre-fill and pre-populate and generate the template or the form that they will then pass on to the legislator or the stakeholder that you want to influence. And we can use information about them to customize it, to personalize it. So oftentimes today, we might have a couple of variations of a form that people can choose in a place where they can input some of their own information that might personalize it a bit. And then that might be an obstacle for some people. A lot of people won't do that, and then you'll end up with a lot of forms that look very similar, which can kind of be grouped together by a person. And we know from a lot of social science studies that some amount of personalization and connection and empathy with the person writing or talking about something is really important. So if you can personalize these messages automatically and remove that obstacle from the person having to do it themselves by including some information you know about them already, and that's pretty easy since we have that information in structured form. There are a few companies like Narrative Science and others that have products that take structured databases and then put them into a more narrative, natural-sounding paragraph form. And that can be really powerful to make advocates feel like you know something about them and remove an obstacle from the process. And then the receiver of that message, the stakeholder, feels like there's more personalization input that they're getting. And so tying it all together, what I hope that we've shown is that AI is a really incredible tool that complements the things that you are able to do. It's not something that removes your work for you. It's something that takes some tasks of it and maybe uses data that you've already collected or can collect to improve upon them, to make them better, and to augment the kinds of things that you're already doing and make it a little bit easier, make it a little better. And it's actually not just for big companies, consumer companies. There's a lot of things that we can do for advocacy and for the advocacy process that are going to complement several parts of it, from the issue identification to the stakeholder identification analysis to then actually figuring out and targeting different advocates and then different messages. And so there's a really nice complement that we can start doing that we've seen in other industries that have done this really well.
Super cool, Vlad, and obviously the closer we can get to the advocates that want to take action for us, the better, and it sounds like AI has a real sort of forward, future-facing way of doing that for us.
Yeah, a future-facing way, and also something that you can do today. So these are not applications that are in the future, as in we don't know how to do them or we're waiting on some technology. These are things that are actually here today.
Terrific. Thank you, Vlad, and thank you to our other speakers, Adam and Josh. If you'd like to find out a little more about how Fiscal Note can help you use technology to aid your advocacy in government relations outcomes and goals, please fill out our survey at the end of the webinar. Keep an eye out for our next one, which will be coming along soon, and have a great day, everyone.